So hello and welcome to today's episode of Character Critiques, and this one is really long overdue, because if you're a long time viewer of the channel you might remember I did this series, I think it's in 2018, where I went over a few of the main characters like Ted Thompson and Johnny Vincent, but for some reason I never actually made an episode on Jimmy. Why? I don't know. But either way, 5 years after the series first aired, we're finally doing an episode on Jimmy. I don't even know how long it's been since the last actual episode. But yeah, let's get straight onto it, and we're going to start talking about the first impressions we get from Jimmy when the game starts. So I think it's fair to say that within the first 10 seconds of playing Bully and watching those intro credits, we kind of get the impression that Jimmy isn't exactly the friendliest Rockstar protagonist out there. He's very brash, dismissive, rude, and has a strong attitude problem. Now that's actually a good thing, because it tells us exactly what kind of Jimmy is straight off the bat. He's a very troubled child, he's a bit of a brat. Now one of the things we do learn about Jimmy through in-game quotes, and even the Welcome to Bullworth mission, is Jimmy does have a rather rough past, which is hinted at being caused by his rather neglected home life, where Jimmy even says he's often ignored by his mother, who he does actually seem to care for, although it does seem like it's a very rocky kind of relationship. At best, it's one-sided, as Jimmy does often lament about her if he stands still, wondering if he should write to her. It's not really known or expanded upon past that really, but given his attitude, I'd assume he does care for his mother a lot, he just doesn't show it. And this is backed up with Final Showdown, where Gary says Jimmy's mom makes a living on her back, is what tipped Jimmy over the edge. I think one of the reasons Jimmy and his mom have a bit of a fragmented relationship is because Jimmy just doesn't like having random men trying to be the father figure in his life. It's interesting because I believe in pretty much all of his quotes, he never mentions his stepdad, nor his real dad actually, nor any of his mum's other marriages. It shows how strongly he dislikes his new stepfather that he never even mentions him once, but he will mention his mother multiple times. It's a good bit of undisclosed lore about Jimmy's background and relationships with his family. You can tell his life at home is pretty rocky at the best of times. Now, to be fair to this one, we don't see Jimmy's parents outside the intro credits, so I think it's a bit unfair to actually talk about his stepfather. For all we know, he could be a bit of a nice bloke, but he and Jimmy have an incredibly bad relationship might make him look worse than he really is. The only cutscene we get with them together is in the intro credits, which itself is a shortened version of a cut intro scene. And in that we get a bit of an argument between them both, with Jimmy being verbally abusive to him, saying he has half a mind, he's fat and bold. And to be fair to Jimmy's stepdad here, if I was in the car with somebody verbally abusing me like that, I'd probably gloat too when I dropped them off, knowing I wouldn't see them for a year or two. Actually, to be honest, it does set up Jimmy quite well. Unlike other Rockstar titles where it usually takes us about, I'd say about the first half hour to an hour to get a feel for our character and what they're really like, it already sets Jimmy up as a very bratty, arrogant child. I'll go as far to say he does come off as quite unlikable during this first scene alone. It's not a bad thing, because it does build his character. And the way Jimmy talks to people is often very rude, aggressive and dismissive, and it shows very early on too. In Welcome to Bullworth alone, he dismisses Miss Danvers, doesn't seem to really give a damn what Crabblesnitch is saying about his track record, and when Pete makes the effort to introduce himself and shake Jimmy's hand, Jimmy doesn't even look at him, or even say hi back. In fact, his first word to Pete, after he introduced himself, is "Jimmy Hopkins and don't ask how I'm doing," in a very dismissive way. But one thing I did notice is over the course of the game, Jimmy's kind of attitude does improve a bit. He becomes much more cooperative and a bit more sociable. At the start he is very miserable, but towards around, I'd say around chapter 4 or so, maybe chapter 3, is when Jimmy starts to become a bit more open. Like going along with Ernest's plan, helping Edna, talking to Pete after dealing with the various cliques, etc. Jimmy still keeps a very aggressive attitude and approach to solving problems, but he isn't afraid to mave off at those who are maving off to him. Now going back to Jimmy's behaviour towards adults and teachers that we see in Welcome to Bullworth, you would be forgiven for thinking Jimmy is like this to all adults. Just typical teenage arrogance. But he does seem to show respect to those who speak to him with respect back. And we see that with the likes of Ms. Phillips, Mr. Galloway and Edna, to name some. Where, unlike what we see with him with Dr. Crabblesnitch and his parents, Jimmy seems to have some level of respect for them because they don't seem to treat him with any disrespect, if that makes sense. Now one thing I noticed with Jimmy is he does seem to have some kind of moral beliefs that show occasionally, usually being in defence of those who are being bullied. Some incidents, for example, include the chapter 4 intro, where Jimmy stands up to Pete when Damon and Ted knock him down, which pretty much inspired the events of chapter 4, where Jimmy teams up with the nerds to publicly humiliate them. But another good example is Mr. Galloway, because there's a bit of a subplot, as you may know, with Mr. Galloway and Mr. Hattrick, where Mr. Hattrick is bullying Mr. Galloway at work. Instead of the childish method of threatening to beat him up or take his lunch money, instead it's a bit more of a adult kind of bullying, workplace bullying. Threatening to get him fired, before sabotaging Hattrick's plans and getting Hattrick fired instead. Thus standing up for Mr. Galloway, who Jimmy believed was being picked on. So another thing with morality is, well, Jimmy is not a GTA protagonist, in any way, shape or form really. He's not a mass killer. But Jimmy does do some very questionable things, with probably the best example is the Mandy photo incident in Chapter 4, where Ernest asks Jimmy to get some incriminating photos of Mandy. At first, Jimmy objects, but then I assume his overly excited 15-year-old brain realises he can get some, am I going to reword this? Good material of the head cheerleader, before then feeling guilty of what he did when he finds Mandy depressed and upset about it. In fact, if you pay attention to the cutscene dialogue in the mission Discretion Assured, and listen to the way Jimmy says, "Oh, those," and offers to get rid of them for Mandy, it shows that Jimmy does not feel proud at all of what he did, and he does try to set things right, even if the damage has been done and Mandy doesn't know it's him. I think it shows a bit of maturity too, since he knows Mandy's a bit of a narcissist, and had a brief, albeit unpleasant run-in with her before. It shows some empathy if Jimmy's willing to help out the bitchy head cheerleader whose naked pictures are all over town. So one of Jimmy's biggest defining traits is he's a very violent person. When it comes to pretty much anything. Jimmy very rarely, if at all, actually plans anything out. He just goes into his problems with his fists swinging like no tomorrow, until he gets the outcome he wants, and then once the fighting's over, then he settles things a bit more calmly. Even Gary telling him that Pete said he was dumb was just enough to get Jimmy to beat Pete up, before Gary stepped in of course. Hell, all you gotta do is take a look at Welcome to Bullwolf again. Jimmy's ready to square up to Russell straight after fighting Wade. And that's something that's a bit of a recurring theme. In Chapter 2, Jimmy mentions he's struggling to beat the preps into submission because everything he's tried has been nothing but violence. Once Jimmy gets expelled in Chapter 5, one of his best ideas is to just storm the townies' plant and beat everybody up. I believe Chapter 4 is the only time Jimmy willingly goes along with a plan, although part of me thinks it's because while he did want to beat Ted up for showing disrespect to Pete, he knows that Ernest and the nerds often get terrorised by Ted and the jocks, and considering that Ernest is a bit of a friend to Jimmy, it's a bit of a smart choice to take a slower approach and help them get revenge too, rather than just smashing Ted's head in on the floor in front of everybody like he normally would prefer to do. Even then, violence is always Jimmy's go-to plans for anyone who even thinks of showing him disrespect. His love of violence really just shows how much of a pent-up person he must be at all times. So here's a random quick question before we carry on, is what do Darby Harrington, Johnny Vincent and Ernest Jones have in common? I'll give you about 5 seconds to think of an answer. Well, the real answer is, all three of these characters view themselves as being a leader in some kind of way. Darby views himself as being better than everybody on Earth combined, likely from the fact his father also runs some companies. Johnny prides himself on being this ultra tough king, and Ernest Jones has his own strong ambitions to become a leader. So Jimmy beating them all and reminding them that they work for him is a bit of a small thing but a massive punch to their egos. It's Jimmy's way of keeping them in place, that they don't rule anything, but Jimmy rules them. And you could argue that this is Jimmy's way of humbling them, reminding them that they are not better than everybody on Earth, and they should stop thinking themselves as being these kings or whatever when they're not. Now this is a bit of a stark contrast to the likes of Russell and Edgar, who despite Jimmy getting into a fight with, and starting on bad terms of course, Jimmy doesn't seem to remind them that they work for him. And one trait I think is interesting to note is neither Russell or Edgar view themselves as being leaders. They might be the leader of the group, sure, but they don't really go around saying, "I own the place." Now speaking of egos, which I also think is a very interesting thing to talk about, is how Jimmy grows one by Chapter 5. And it's pretty obvious that the Jimmy from Chapter 1 who was miserable, didn't really care for taking over the school and wanted to be left alone is dead, and we have this new Jimmy who's extroverted and quite obnoxiously full of himself. I really don't think the same Jimmy from the beginning of the game would have been that full of himself to constantly remind Bullwolf that he rules them. I think it's a very realistic bit of character growth, because we all know somebody who got a bit popular once, and then just thought they were better than God himself and ruled the world. Though as they say, what goes around comes around, and Jimmy himself gets a bit of a humbling too, after he tags City Hall, returns and finds everybody hates him. He soon learns that being a leader isn't all rainbows and sunshine, and unlimited power. But to be fair to Jimmy, he manages to keep a rather level head throughout it all. Jimmy's ego gets popped massively, and you notice his attitude of I'm the king of everything around here quickly disappears, and now Jimmy takes things a bit more seriously and slowly, and wanting to get to the bottom of things. It is a weirdly quick personality change, but it does work really well. It shows that Jimmy does have the capability to be a proper leader, once he ditches the attitude of thinking he owns everything and everyone. I think this might be the best time to bring up the GTA series as well actually. I've seen many people ask or wonder how Jimmy would fit into the world of Grand Theft Auto, or if he should make an appearance in GTA 6, 7, GTA Online or whatever. But I don't think Jimmy fits most of the traits of a GTA character at all. When you look at the average Rockstar Protagonist cast, they all have a strong background in organised crime and strong affiliations with a specific gang, and God knows how many crimes under their belts before the game's even started. Tommy Vercetti, for example, in Vice City, he starts the game after serving a prison sentence for killing 11 men and has just done a drug deal. Michael DeSanta is a prominent bank robber who served time in prison as well. Niko Bellic was a participant in the Yugoslav wars, and hell, he even admits himself that he killed people, smuggled people and sold people. You get the idea. The list of crimes a GTA protagonist commits are not very light. Now Jimmy never does anything like that at all. He's violent, but he doesn't really engage in anything like the GTA characters do. Jimmy just fights people, with non-lethal weapons and maybe bullies them with wedgies, throwing stink bombs and eggs at them. He's never murdered anybody, nor engaged in any drugs or assassinations or carjackings. I think the worst thing that Jimmy does is regular, albeit exaggerated, stereotypical teenage hoodlum kind of stuff. I mean, okay, technically I think one of the worst things Jimmy does is maybe shoots people with a spud gun, but even then it's a spud gun, it's not exactly a Spaz 12, or going on a massacre blowing cars up on the highway. And I believe it was Sam Hauser, I think it was Sam, who also stated that Jimmy is just a badly behaved teenager, his home life's crap but he won't be a carjacker. It's also difficult to talk about Jimmy without talking about Pete, since throughout everything, Pete is Jimmy's right hand man. And the dynamic between them both is done quite well, because they're both loners. Jimmy just doesn't really care, and Pete's just seen as a social outcast with bad social skills. Jimmy and Pete are just complete polar opposites of one another. Jimmy is brash, violent and hard-headed with a view of violence first. Pete is much more timid, he's conflict avoiding and quite calm, with more views of rational thinking first. In fact, a recurring theme throughout the story is Pete not tagging along with Jimmy's adventures. And I know some might have liked to have seen Pete partaking in them, but I think Jimmy storming off without him is one, perfectly in character for Jimmy because it's an opportunity for Jimmy to get into a fight, and two, I think Jimmy knows Pete would just be a bit of a massive hindrance, given Pete's non-violent tendencies and lack of experience in fighting. Jimmy does listen to Pete's advice and ideas multiple times, so it shows that he does value him as an ally at the very minimum. I've heard some say that Jimmy's a bit of a prick to Pete, but I think that's just Jimmy's rough social skills considering he speaks to pretty much everybody the same way, be it friend or foe. He clearly views Pete as a friend considering he stood up for him towards Ted and Damon, and also often thanks Pete for his help too. Now speaking of another friendship, this is going to be a bit of an unpopular opinion, but I think Jimmy and Zoe's relationship was just incredibly rushed. They meet in chapter 5, 2 missions together, and then Jimmy says he loves her. Romeo and Juliet, eat your heart out. Although, actually, I guess you could say it is a bit realistic in a way. Many teenagers do mistake having a crush as love, especially around Jimmy's age, so either way, I think they could have done a bit more with it, like expand on it a bit more with some missions, maybe give Zoe a couple of side missions to sort of build her up and develop it from there. I think they really could have just expanded on it more rather than just the 2 missions and then suddenly they're in a relationship. It works well with Lola's character because that's exactly the kind of character Lola is. She just goes with any boy she can. But not Zoe. I think Zoe really could have had a bit more character development with Jimmy. Now speaking of that as well, I know it's common for the community to ship Jimmy with all kinds of girls or boys. Personally, I don't really understand this whole shipping thing. I really don't, but I know some people do. But the only thing I'm going to say is I think Jimmy and Zoe is still the most likely. The most two common ones I believe I usually see are Pinky and Beatrice. But I think the problem with Beatrice is Jimmy does show a bit of minor disgust when he learns how she feels about him, but he has no problem kissing her. And Pinky, well, if you listen to the deleted carnival datelines, you can tell he really does not Pinky's attitude towards poor people. But that's probably one of the better things about Buddy, is you do have complete free will on how you want to control Jimmy in free mode. Do you want Jimmy and Zoe to be together? If not, then go with whoever you want really. I think the customization we get Jimmy is some of the best we've ever seen from Rockstar. Maybe second only to GTA San Andreas. As with that we do have the option to make CJ fat or muscular, but regardless the customization we get for Jimmy is brilliant. We have such a wide variety of clothes and costumes to choose from a wide range of different styles. We have like sporty, upper class, punk, stupid costumes and everything you can think of in between. So we can really kit Jimmy out to how we dress in real life, or maybe dress like our favourite clique, a character you might know from a TV show or another game. And to be honest, one of the things that I do think is underappreciated about Buddy's character customization is how, unlike GTA where every single shirt is a clear retexture, the trousers and the shirts often aren't. Like you look at one t-shirt and then you look at another and Jimmy wears them differently. Be it tucked in or not tucked in, having a jacket zipped down, you get the idea. It's just really tiny attention to detail like that I think deserves a lot of praise. Because they could have just went with that route, but they didn't, so I think that deserves some rightfully earned praise. Now the same also applies to haircuts, because we do have an incredibly large range to choose from. Do we want Jimmy looking like a punk? Do we want him looking smart? Or do we want to give Jimmy a bit of a cut close to what we have in real life? Now while the hairstyles are wide and varied, they do seem to be limited somewhat, and I would argue they're probably the weakest part of Buddy's character customization. Mostly because you cannot wear a hat, because if you do, Jimmy's hair defaults back to a buzz cut. And when I say that, I don't mean like, oh, you know, you give Jimmy a mohawk. What do you expect? Do you expect his hat to be worn on top of his mohawk spike? I don't mean anything like that. I mean that even if you give Jimmy, say, a full head of black hair, and you put on, say, a baseball cap, Jimmy goes back to the buzz cut, the same ginger buzz cut he had at the beginning. Now with the colours, you are pretty much stuck between ginger, brown and black pretty much for all of them. There are some of the punkish looking haircuts which do give you more colours, which I do like, but yeah, I do think the one thing that does let it down is, as said, it's just the hats. Now this to me is a bit of a wasted opportunity because Rockstar perfected it with GTA San Andreas. Like if you give CJ a blonde afro for example and make CJ wear a hat, CJ will obviously lose the afro, but with the hair you can still see he's blonde. Although one of the things I did learn is one of the reasons why it's like this is all of Buddy's hat models are sort of tied to the model of Jimmy's head, if that makes sense. Unlike San Andreas where the hats are all completely different models separated from CJ's head. But yeah, I think that's probably the weakest part of Jimmy's customization. Well, that and the tattoos, because while you can get tattoos, you just can't get rid of them. And I don't know why that is. I know someone's going to say that it's like real life, you can't just get a tattoo, think, I don't like it, get it removed. It doesn't work like that. But it's a game. You know, it's not the most realistic game out there, so you know, it's not the most realistic. I mean, it's the same game where you can beat up a police officer and see that same police officer later on and not get thrown in prison for it. Now, another option of customization you have is making Jimmy bisexual if you want, which to date is the only Rockstar game that gives you free will over the protagonist's sexuality. All GTA and Red Dead Redemption protagonists are pretty much straight, which this part with Jimmy being bisexual has been praised by the LGBT community, and the thing is, it's entirely optional. If you're bisexual or gay yourself and you want Jimmy to represent you, you can. There's one boy from every clique that Jimmy can kiss, go for it. On the other side, if you're straight, or a homophobe, you can completely ignore it and you'll probably never encounter the option to do so anyway. Jimmy Hopkins definitely has one of Rockstar's finest character customizations out there. Hopefully in any future Rockstar game, we get a mix between Buddy and its very clothes and outfit system, with a mix of GTA San Andreas' weight. And maybe Red Dead Redemption 2 for the dynamic hair growth, although I know that's a bit controversial, some people didn't like it. I actually did quite like it, but I know some people didn't. Maybe I'll expand upon that if I talk about Red Dead 2, but yeah. All in all, Jimmy Hopkins is a fantastic protagonist. I think excluding his very excessive violent tendencies, he's also Rockstar's most realistic protagonist. And I think most of that is down to the fact that he's just a teenager in a school, something that pretty much everybody has and will experience in their life. Unlike Grand Theft Auto, where our protagonists have a strong background in organised crime, nearly everything that Jimmy experiences during his time at Bullworth is something we all likely have experienced during our own school years too, even if some of them are exaggerated for comedic effect, like Chapter 4. But still, Rockstar Vancouver did an amazing job at capturing the life and attitude of a schoolboy without it coming off as cringe or that hello fellow kids material, especially in the era of social media where you see so many corporations trying to be relatable to today's youth, with their hashtag relatable memes. And I guess you can't really compare the likes of corporate advertising to a main character from a game, but even then you see sometimes that they try to write younger characters and they fail miserably because they just base them off stereotypes that they get offline. Online, sorry. But yeah, that's it for today's video. Thank you for watching and have a great day.